Wyoming Territory, June 3, 1883. The sun was too bright for a day meant to ruin a woman. The church stood quiet under the cottonwood trees on the edge of Laramie. The pews were filled, the preacher was waiting, and Susanna Norwood stood in white lace at the chapel doors with her hand resting on her father's arm. But the groom, the son of a cattle baron, full of promises just a week ago, was nowhere in sight. Then came the whispers. A buckboard wagon seen heading west at sunrise. A saloon girl named me who had not come home last night. Her father, red-faced and stiff, stepped away with a muttered curse. Her mother cried quietly into a handkerchief. Susanna stood frozen. The sun was too loud, the silence too cruel. Her heart thudded like a horse's hooves in the distance, but it was not hope, it was humiliation. She looked down at her bare hand. The ring was gone. The vows were gone. The future was gone, and still, everyone stared. From the back of the churchyard, a man stepped forward. Dusty boots, a weather-worn hat, and a coat that had seen more winters than it should have. He had not been invited. He had not spoken when he arrived. But he walked with purpose, and when he stopped in front of her, his dark brown eyes held something solid. Not pity, not surprise. Just something steady. "Miss Norwood," he said, voice low and rough like river stones, "I reckon you do not deserve to be left standin' like that." She blinked at him. He pulled something from his vest pocket. She knew that ring. The one that had been meant for her hand. It must have been left behind in the groom's haste on the altar, discarded like her. The cowboy looked at her hand. "May I?" She nodded because she could not find her voice. He slipped the ring onto her finger, slow, careful, like it mattered. His hand was warm, calloused from years of work. He held her gaze the whole time. "I am Boone Oaks," he said, "and if you need someone to stand beside you today, I will." A murmur rustled the crowd. Her mother gasped. Her father looked ready to strike someone. But Susanna stared at the ring on her hand, then back at the man who had placed it there. He was a stranger, a cowboy. She did not even know where he came from, but he had not looked away from her, and he was not leaving. She let out a slow breath. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not even know me." Boone shifted his weight. "I saw what he did. That was a coward, not a man. You walked out here ready to give your heart to someone who did not deserve it. I figured you should not be alone." Susanna blinked back, the sting in her eyes, then her father stepped forward. "This is madness. You cannot just—" Boone turned to him, calm but unflinching. "Sir, I am not looking to shame your daughter more than she has already been. I am offering her dignity. And if she will have it, I'll give her my word I will treat her right." Susanna's heart kicked hard. Boone looked back at her. "I do not expect anything, but I meant it when I said I would stand by you." Everyone was still, and for the first time since the morning began, Susanna stood straight. "All right," she said. The preacher cleared his throat, confused. Well, are you asking me to?" Susanna looked at Boone, felt the warmth of the ring on her hand, and nodded. "Yes." The preacher hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. "Then let us begin." It was not the wedding she had imagined. There were no flowers in her hair. Her hands trembled. But Boone held her gaze the whole time, and when he said his vows, he meant every word like it had weight. "I, Boone Oaks, take you, Susanna Norwood, to be my wife." He spoke like a man who did not say things he did not mean, and when she echoed the words back to him, she felt like maybe, just maybe, this was not the end of her story. It was a beginning. Hours later, the sun dipped low and the church had emptied. Susanna sat on the steps, her dress dust-smudged, her mind still spinning. Boone came up beside her, handed her a tin cup of water. "I know this ain't what you pictured," he said. "No," she admitted softly. "But I think it might be better than what I almost got." He sat beside her, not too close, not too far. His presence was quiet, steady. I have a small place north of town, he said. Not much, but it is decent land. You do not have to come right away. I can fix it up some. She looked at him, really looked this time. He had lines around his eyes from squinting into sun, faint scars on his knuckles, a quiet strength that did not need to prove itself. I would like to see it, she said. He smiled, not wide, not showy, but real. All right then. They sat in silence for a while, just the breeze and the sound of distant crickets. Why did you really do it? She asked after a while. Boone looked toward the horizon. Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. And I saw something in your eyes that told me you needed someone to choose you, not just say the words, but mean them. Susanna swallowed hard. No one had ever said that to her. And somehow, it mattered more than all the promises she had heard before. That night, Boone led her to his old buckskin horse tied behind the church. She took his hand as he helped her into the saddle. And for the first time that day, she smiled. She did not know what would come next. But the man beside her, the one who had stepped forward when everyone else stepped back, he was real. And that was a start. Boone's cabin stood a half-day's ride north of Laramie, tucked beneath a ridge of low hills where the wind shifted slower, more thoughtfully. The land there was lean but solid sparse pine, dry grass, and soil that held enough promise if a man worked it honest. A single chimney smoked faintly as they approached, dusk falling in long lavender streaks across the prairie. Boone swung down from the saddle and offered his hand. Susanna accepted it without hesitation this time. Her gloves had been packed away, and her fingers met his bare. She steadied herself, skirt brushing against his coat as she stepped to the ground. The air smelled of juniper and old wood. I built it 9 years ago, Boone said, leading her toward the small front porch. Took me a summer and part of a fall. Thought I'd be moving on after a year, but I stayed. What changed your mind? She asked, following his gaze to the rolling hills beyond. Things quieted, he said. And I got tired of running from memories that never did stop following. He opened the door for her, tipping his hat slightly as she stepped inside. The interior was plain but tended. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed tucked against the far wall with a wool blanket folded tight. A rifle rested in a rack beside the door, and a shelf above the hearth held a small row of books, their spines cracked from reading. Susanna set her bag down near the table. No one else lives out this way. Closest neighbor's 5 miles west. She's a widow, raises goats. He poured water from a jug into a basin. You can wash up if you like. I'll see to the horses. She nodded, dipping her hands into the cold water once he stepped out. The basin was tin, the towel coarse, but it felt grounding. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her face looked different than it had that morning. Less polished, more certain. Boone returned after a while, brushing dirt from his sleeves. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, he said simply. You can have the bed, her brow creased. You don't have to do that. I know, he said, but I figure you deserve time, space too. She looked at the bed, then back at him. You've made room for me. More than I asked. You didn't ask, he said, not unkindly. That's the part that matters. The room held quiet for a moment, the kind that isn't awkward but full of things not yet spoken. The fire cracked low in the hearth. Susanna stepped closer, fingers grazing the back of one of the chairs. Did you ever think you'd marry? She asked. Didn't expect to, Boone said, resting his hands on his belt. Figured it wasn't for a man who'd lived the way I have. She turned toward him. And how is that? He took a breath. Too long on cattle drives, too many nights in places I'm not proud of. I kept to myself mostly, never put down roots till now, Susanna nodded slowly. I cared more about doing what was expected than what I wanted. I didn't see the cracks in him because I didn't want to. Boone's eyes held hers. It wasn't your fault. She swallowed, folding her arms. Maybe not. But I let it happen. I said yes when I should have waited. Boone didn't rush to respond. He just walked to the hearth, crouched down, and stirred the coals to life with a piece of iron. "You didn't wait," he said finally, "but you still ended up here. And here ain't the worst place to begin again." A gust of wind brushed against the shutters. Susanna moved toward the fire, drawn to the warmth. Boone stood and stepped aside, letting her take his place without a word. "Would you tell me about your mother?" she asked suddenly. He looked surprised but not displeased. "She died when I was 16, taught me how to mend a shirt and shoot with both hands. She read by lamp every night after supper, said it kept her from fading." Susanna smiled faintly. "My mother embroidered roses into every handkerchief I ever owned. Even the ones I ruined." Boone chuckled, quiet and low. "Sounds like she hoped for gentler days." "She did," Susanna said, voice softening. "She just never knew how to find them." Boone leaned against the mantel. "Maybe you will." Their eyes met and something passed between them. Not promise, not yet, but recognition. He stepped back, reaching for his coat. "I'll be out in the barn if you need anything." She hesitated. "Boone," he paused in the doorway. "I would like to help with the animals, with the house. I don't want to just be a burden." His expression shifted, a flicker of something like respect. "All right, we'll start come morning. I've got a fence needs mending." She nodded. He tipped his hat once more, then stepped out into the dark. Susanna stood alone in the quiet room, the firelight flickering across the walls. She touched the ring still on her finger. It caught the light like it had always belonged there. She sat down on the edge of the bed, boots still on, and looked toward the door he'd just closed behind him. There was no ceremony in what had begun between them. No grand declarations. Just a man who saw her, and a woman who was beginning to see herself. Outside, the wind settled, and inside she no longer felt abandoned. At first light, Boone handed her a pair of work gloves and pointed out a sagging stretch of fence that traced the edge of the east pasture. The boards leaned wrong, nails rusted through or missing entirely. A few posts had shifted from the frost heave last winter, and the wire hung loose in long, tired loops. Susanna set her jaw and pulled the gloves on. Her hands weren't used to tools, but they'd steadied teacups through her mother's luncheons and stitched hems by lamp. Surely they could learn this too. "I'll dig out the post hole," Boone said, sizing up the lean of one cedar upright. "You brace it once it's out. Keep the top straight." She crouched beside the pile of fresh-cut rails he'd hauled over earlier, eyes narrowed at the angle of the job. "Does the earth swallow posts like this every year? Some years worse than others. Snow packs it down. Then the spring gives it back with mud." They worked without much talk, the rhythm settling between them. Boone moved steady, never rushing, and showed her how to measure the depth with the handle of the hammer. When her braid caught on a nail, he didn't laugh, just reached up and loosened it gently, then tipped his head toward the wind. "Storm's not far off," he said. "We'll drive what we can before it hits." By mid-morning, clouds began to gather low behind the hills. The horses stirred in the paddock, uneasy. Boone ran the back of his hand across his brow, then glanced over at her. "You holding up?" Susanna stood, dusting her skirt. "My arms feel like they've been wrung out, but I'm still upright." He gave a small nod. "That's better than most." They made it to the last post before the first drops fell, a slow, steady start that promised worse. Boone gathered the tools, and Susanna followed him back to the cabin, her shoulders sore but her steps firm. Inside, the air held the scent of pine smoke and something simmering. He'd lit the stove before dawn, and a kettle now hissed softly. She peeled off her gloves and hung them beside the door, watching him move about the space with quiet efficiency. "I've never mended a fence before," she said, easing down onto the bench near the table. "You'd never know it," Boone replied, stirring the pot. "Most people give up halfway through, start cussing or quitting. You didn't." She rested her elbows on the table, chin in her palm. "I was afraid I'd break something." He looked over his shoulder. "Things break easy. What matters is whether you bother to mend 'em." Rain started tapping the roof as he ladled soup into 2 tin bowls. He set one in front of her, then took the other and sat opposite. They ate without ceremony, spoons clinking against the sides. "What brought you to Wyoming?" he asked after a few bites. "Laramie's not where most folks end up unless they're aiming for something or running from it." Susanna paused, then set her spoon down. "My father thought the air would clear my younger brother's lungs. He didn't make it through the first winter. After that, we stayed because Mother said leaving would feel too much like forgetting." Boone's gaze dropped to his bowl. "Sorry," she nodded. "I don't talk about him often. But I think about him every time the wind changes." They sat with that for a moment. Then Boone said, "I left Georgia after the war, didn't have much left there. The land was gone, and so were most of the people I knew. I drifted a while, worked cattle, packed freight through Montana, tried mining once. All of it left me feeling like I was standing on borrowed ground. And now this place is mine. Maybe not much, but it holds quiet. I think that's all I ever wanted." She traced the rim of her bowl. "You said before that you know what it's like to be left behind. Was it a woman?" He didn't answer right away. Then he set his spoon down carefully. "No, it was my older brother. He served under General Hood, never came back. I waited 2 years before I let the truth settle in." Susanna folded her hands. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He leaned back slightly. "But it taught me something. You can keep living with the ache, or you can build something that holds it without letting it hollow you." Outside, the rain thickened, rolling down the windows in silver strands. Boone stood and added another log to the fire. The warmth crept up slow, filling the corners of the room. When he turned back, Susanna was watching him, not out of curiosity but with the kind of attention that comes from seeing someone not for what they might become, but for what they already are. "I'd like to learn how to ride," she said. "Properly. Not just side saddle around a garden path," he nodded. "We'll start when the ground dries. I've got a roan mare who's patient. You'll match well." She smiled, faint but certain. "Thank you." Boone glanced at the settling logs. "You'll take the bed again tonight." She shook her head. "I think I'd rather stay near the fire. The sound of the rain feels like company." He fetched a quilt from the trunk and laid it across the floor near the hearth. "It does that." As she settled down, he paused, then crouched beside her. "Tomorrow, we'll work on the chicken coop. Fox got in last week. I've got wire needs setting." She met his eyes. "I'll be ready." Boone rose and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. "You're not what I expected," he said. Susanna looked up. "Neither are you." He nodded once, then stepped out into the rain. She lay back, listening to the soft patter above and the slow, steady crackle of the fire. The warmth of the quilt settled around her shoulders, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the weight of her own breath ease. The ring on her finger caught the firelight. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. The storm passed by morning, leaving the earth soaked and the air sharp with the scent of wet sage. Susanna rose stiffly from the hearth, her back sore from the floor but her breath steady. Outside the windows, fine mist clung to the hills, and the sky held the dull silver of a day that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be. She stepped into her boots and tied back her hair. Boone hadn't come in overnight. The barn door stood closed across the yard, a curl of steam rising from a kettle left on the stove, still warm enough to coax from it a cup of tea. She poured herself half a tin and carried it outside. The mud clung to her skirt as she crossed the yard. Boone stood behind the barn, sleeves rolled, driving nails through a fresh plank on the chicken coop's roof. The hens watched him from their pen with wary intelligence. He glanced down when she approached. "You sleep any?" "Enough," she said, lifting her cup. "You?" He tapped the head of a nail flush, then sat back on his heels. "Barn roof leaks, but the hay stayed dry. Can't complain." She watched the hammer settle beside him in the dirt, its handle smooth from use. "I could climb up and finish one side if you show me where to place the shingles. You afraid of heights?" "No," she said, "just of being idle." That earned a low chuckle. He stood and offered her a hand up the ladder. She climbed, careful with each step, and he passed her the shingle bundle without another word. They worked side by side, her hands growing more sure as the morning wore on. Boone didn't hover, just pointed once in a while, letting her find her rhythm. When they both climbed down, the coop roof gleamed dark with new wood, and the hens clucked as if in approval. Back inside, Boone rinsed his hands in the basin and dried them on the edge of his coat. "You've taken to this faster than I figured," he said. "I wasn't raised to sit still," she replied. "My mother kept a strict household. Everything had its place, and so did I." Boone leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You ever want something different?" She nodded. "But I didn't know what it was until it didn't come." He studied her then, not just her words but the way she stood, the way her fingers curled slightly against her skirt like she still braced for something. "I'd like to show you the North Ridge," he said after a pause. "There's an old cottonwood up there, struck by lightning last summer, still standing." She looked toward the window. "Will the trail be passable if we ride slow?" he said. "Ground soft but not sunk." She fetched her shawl and they saddled the horses in quiet. Boone's mare moved easily under the bridle, and Susanna's seat grew steadier as they rode. The trail curved through tall grass and up a narrow rise where the wind picked up again. The tree stood alone near the top, bark scorched black down one side, but branches still raised like arms that refused to lower. Susanna dismounted and stepped closer, one hand brushing the trunk. "It should have died," she said. Boone nodded. "Most do. And yet, some things hold on." She turned to him. "Why bring me here?" He looked out over the land stretching wide below them. "Because I wanted you to see something that bent but didn't fall. It felt right." Her eyes traced the horizon. "I've been told I'm too proud, that I hold things too close." "I don't see that," he said. "I see a woman who's still standing." The wind tugged her shawl. She didn't pull it tighter. Boone stepped closer. "I've been thinking on something." She waited. "This thing between us," he said. "It began strange, sudden. But it don't feel uncertain. You could leave, no shame in it. I'd help you pack your things and see you safe wherever you chose. But if you stay, I'd want it to be for truth, not for debt." Susanna looked at him fully now, her hands still. "I didn't stay out of obligation," she said. "I stayed because I felt seen, and because I didn't want to go back to being someone who was only ever chosen for show." Boone's jaw shifted, a flicker of something quiet passing behind his eyes. "Then I reckon we've got something worth tending." She reached out, gently took his hand. "We do." He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. They stood together beneath that wounded tree, wind threading through the tall grass, the land wide and open below. And though the day was gray, the light between them was certain. By late July, the land had dried into gold. The stream east of the cabin shrank to a ribbon, and the cottonwoods whispered quieter in the heat. Susanna had taken to rising before the sun, pulling water from the well before the rope burned too hot in her hands. Boone had started trusting her with the tack, letting her ready the mare herself while he checked the outer pasture. One morning, she found him near the edge of the bluff with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a poleaxe in his hand. He was watching a bull that had wandered too close to the drop. "Fence there gave," he said. "Old post rotted clean through. Beast got through sometime last night. Will it hold if we brace it with stone?" Boone gave her a glance, half assessing, half admiring. "You think like someone who means to stay." "I do," she said, and meant it. They worked through the morning, dragging flat rocks from the creek and stacking them against the new post like a cradle. Dust clung to her arms and sweat stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. Boone didn't offer to take over. He only handed her a fresh nail when she needed it. Later, over the midday meal, she lifted a hand to her shoulder and winced. Boone noticed. "You tore something?" "No, just stiff." She flexed her fingers, then looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You ever think about adding more stock?" He set his bread down. "I did. Before the drought last year. Had to trade 2 heifers for feed and sell the rest to a man down near Rawlins. You ever think about trying again?" He studied her a moment, then leaned back. "I would if I had someone to run it with me, someone I trusted not to flinch when the work got lean." She felt the weight of those words settle clean. "Then try." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the table and touched her hand just once, not hesitant, certain. That night, she brought out the ledger she'd found at the bottom of his trunk. The one with water-damaged corners and names written in fading pencil. She lay it flat beside the lamp and turned the pages one by one. "You kept accounts," she said as he leaned over her shoulder. "Even when you had nothing left to count." He nodded. "Didn't seem right to forget." She touched the edge of the page. "Then let's start a new one." They began planning over scraps of paper and worn maps, marking which hills grew the best grass and which neighbors might be willing to trade. She suggested breeding hens that could be sold in town. He mentioned setting up a shed for tools, saving the barn for hay and animals only. They talked late, not just of the land, but of the life they could shape from it. One evening, Boone brought home a sack of flour, a bolt of sturdy cotton, and a small tin box. Susanna washed her hands, dried them on the apron she'd sewn from old feed cloth, and opened the box. Inside lay a brooch. Rose gold with a pale blue stone set in the center. "It was my mother's," Boone said. "Came from Savannah. I found it in the lining of an old coat after the war, been keeping it since." She looked at him. "Why give it to me?" "Because what's mine is yours now," he said. "And because I want you to know I mean this. Not just the work or the days here, but all of it." Susanna closed the box gently and set it aside. Then she stepped to him, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. Soft, real, steady. When she pulled back, her voice was quiet. "I love you." Boone's throat moved before he answered. "I love you too." He kissed her again, arms around her waist, holding her like something he'd never risk losing. They married in early August, just the two of them and the widow from 5 miles west, who brought a tin of molasses cookies and a dress Susanna could borrow. They stood under the cottonwood near the ridge, the one that had weathered lightning and still held its shape. Boone wore his cleanest shirt. Susanna wore her hair loose. When they exchanged vows, Boone held her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. She looked into his eyes and saw no trace of the man who had stepped forward out of pity, only a partner, a home. Afterward, they rode back down the trail together. No procession, no celebration. But when they reached the cabin, Boone lifted her from the saddle and carried her across the threshold, laughing low in his chest like he hadn't in years. That night, the fire burned low, and the air turned cool. They lay close beneath the quilt, her head tucked beneath his chin, his hand resting on her hip. "Tell me something you never told anyone," she whispered. Boone brushed his lips against her hair. "I used to dream of building a place like this, but in those dreams I never saw who was inside. Just the walls. And now I don't dream it, I just live it." She smiled against his skin. Me too. In the months that followed, they planted winter rye, repaired the roof, and started building the shed they'd talked about. The hens laid well through the cold nights, and the mare foaled in early spring. Susanna delivered it herself, hands calm, breath steady, Boone beside her with a blanket and quiet pride in his eyes. They named the foal Hope. Years came and went. The land stayed honest, the work unrelenting but fair. They never grew rich, but they never wanted more than what they had. On warm evenings, they sat on the porch with their hands linked, watching the wind move through the grass. Boone would read aloud from one of the books above the hearth, and Susanna would rest her head on his shoulder, eyes closed, listening. And each night before the lamp was turned down, Boone would trace the brooch at her collar and kiss her like it was always the first time. They grew old that way, side by side, hearts steady, and they were happy.